You're listening to The Good Fight, where campus meets Christ.
Greetings, I am Grace-Elleda Gonzalez.
And I'm Timothy Kinnaman.
And today on The Good Fight, we are going to be talking about faithfulness, which, is an interesting one.
It is an interesting one. And it's so interesting that we're talking about faithfulness and that we've titled this episode Rock Solid. Why would we do that?
We say that every week. Like, this is interesting.
I think everything we talk about is interesting.
I think that I'm glad to hear that. I think it makes working on it easier.
It certainly does. To answer my own question, the reason why we've titled an episode about faithfulness Rock Solid is because that's what faithfulness has to do with. This idea of stability, right? Like a rock. It
persevering through time.
Yeah, it just, it's just solid. Rock solid, in fact. And so when you're faithful, you are also rock solid. Mm-hmm. What that means, well, hopefully we can talk about that a little more, but rock solid.
Yeah, so I think in coming up with examples of what kind of being faithful looks like in our lives, I think something like promises stand out as a big one, where it's like someone's faithful if they're upholding their promises. So you have big ones like marriage, where you're like, you have the traditional, like I do, like I will love you in health
till death do us part,
whether like in health and in sickness. Mm-hmm. And you're basically making a promise, and you're faithful if you are upholding that. But then we were also talking about how there's like not every promise, or not everything you're faithful to is like a direct promise. I don't say I promised everything I do, but there are a lot of implicits. Like say that I'll do something, or I have an obligation to do something, and I can be faithful to those obligations. So right now, I am going to not be faithful to one of my obligations this very night.
Yep. Unfortunately.
Neither one of us will, actually. In recording this, we are going to be missing the beginning of the Witnesses launch party for our Volume 7. Volume 7 Part 2? I forget how it's titled. Volume 7 Issue 2? Issue, yes. Issue, that's the word. We have a launch party, and we're not going to make it. We're not going to make it to it.
We'll be late. Hopefully we can show up to some.
But that's obviously not really being faithful, right?
And as a plug, go read that issue.
Wonderful articles on there.
Brokenness.
You can find it in our website under print issues, I think, or go to our Instagram and it's in our bio, and maybe it'll eventually be up on Facebook sometime when I get to it. But yes, that's this idea of not being faithful, right? Like neither one of us is going to be faithful towards our obligation as staffers of Witness tonight.
Yes. Ugh. Well, staffers and
writers.
And writers, right. And so
double whammy.
And I mean, I think even the idea of most organizations you can join, I think what you'll end up with, if you're with it long enough, is you'll end up with obligations. Mm-hmm. Even with a job, I think, viewing your job as an obligation, you kind of have to be faithful in that job if you want to keep it.
Right, yeah.
And, I mean, from that more broad idea of obligations, though, I think everyone still makes promises. I just think we don't think about them as much to make them very explicit. But they're usually more founded than an obligation. Mm-hmm. They have more meaning to a relationship.
Right. And I think saying relationship is probably key when we're all in relationships, right? Of some form, friendships. Mm-hmm. Or just familial relationships. And all of those have a lot of promises in them. So like with a friendship, normally you're kind of making a promise to check in on them and talk to them and be vulnerable with them and be able to, like, I guess, have them be vulnerable with you. Mm-hmm. And you're making this promise by becoming friends with someone to kind of take on more responsibilities in a relationship than you would have if you were just acquaintances. Mm-hmm. And I think y'all have can think of a scenario where you haven't kept a promise, where you have kept a promise. I think the ones we remember the best are probably when people have not kept a promise to us that's
Right.
like it sticks around a whole lot longer than the ones that we haven't upheld promises to other people.
And something that's interesting to me when we think about this idea of promises as opposed to obligations is how much more they seem to be related to childhood and childhood relationships. Like, I think it's very colloquial to think of pinky promises, and I somewhat incorrectly equated that with childhood,
which I very quickly, rebuked him for.
Yes.
Because I do in fact still make my friends do pinky promises. I think as we all should.
That was my bad.
Yeah.
And pinky promise, no crosses count, or other variations on that idea. It's like as a kid, it's so important that your friends stay faithful. Somehow we lose that as we grow up. I don't know why, but
maybe it's because we start overcommitting ourselves. I don't know.
But it's true.
I think obviously that's not the only thing. Like faithfulness in kind of like a more romantic relationship. I don't think you need to like saying, "Oh, I have all these other obligations." That's like a cop out. It's not even.
Yeah. No.
But when it comes to kind of these other forms of promises, I think there's definitely the sense of like promising too much. Yeah. Anyway, when we were talking about kind of this idea of faithfulness and promises, I kept hearing this song over and over in my head, and it's literally called Promises. It's by Maverick City Music, and I really, really love the song. I love it a lot. It's just, I don't know. It's wonderful. It's a gem. And it starts by saying, like, God of Abraham, you're the God of covenant and of faithful promises. Time and time again, you have proven you'll do just what you said. Though the storms may come and the winds may blow, I'll remain steady and let my heart learn when you speak a word, it'll come to pass. And that really, the song goes on, which we'll get to later on, but it really was a framework for kind of the way we wanted to even be talking about this idea of promises first. And so keeping that in the back of our mind and kind of jump right into, I forget what verse we wanted to start at.
Well, I actually want to give a little more more background. So we talked about promises last week, in some form of context. And so this week, I think what we're doing is we're really diving into some specific promises that God has made throughout time. And as we dive into the Bible, right, we've called it this story. This week and next week, what we're really going to see is that story unfold. And so this week we're talking about faithfulness, and what we're doing is actually spending our entire time in the Old Testament, as opposed to all the weeks before we've either been in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, or exclusively in the New Testament. This might be a little different. The Old Testament is certainly written slightly differently from the New Testament, but I think hopefully by the end of next week, you'll have an idea of what that great story is that we've been talking about, and you'll be able to understand the complete narrative. And so to dive in, we're actually going to start not at the very beginning, but right where this song you've given us begins, which is God of Abraham. And so in Genesis chapter 17, we actually see what that means, because this is where God makes a covenant with Abraham. He makes a promise. And the very beginning of chapter 17 talks about this. And just to clarify, right, Abraham is not actually his original name. His original name is Abram. And what happens in this verse is part of the promise is changing his name, part of that covenant. And so chapter 17 goes, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. So we see this idea of faithfulness already, and the idea of covenant, of promise.
And they're very intertwined. Just in their, like, the faithfulness is required for the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is something we don't always think about when we break it down. Like, when we break down what a covenant really means, it becomes apparent. But when you're kind of thinking about it, like, oh, yes, I will make a covenant with you. Sometimes the implications of that don't always cross our mind right away. Or at least not for me.
So what you're saying is, like, without the faithfulness, there is no covenant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would agree with that. And I think that's what we're going to see. And so, what does this covenant mean?
I guess, actually, wait, backtracking back to, like, without the faithfulness, there is no covenant. I think there is something important to be said, which is the covenant still exists. Like, the covenant was still a covenant.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the breaking of a covenant. So it's not like the covenant is void. It's just, you have broken a covenant. Which is like, come on, man. So, sorry, continue.
Yeah, I mean, what does this covenant mean? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we're basically talking about the relationship between God and Abram. Well, what will be Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
And what's also in this case, well, we see this later on, but this isn't just a covenant between God and Abraham. This is a covenant between God and all of Abraham's descendants.
Right. In verse 7,
yeah.
I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. That's pretty big. That's a big covenant. I don't know. Everlasting?
Yeah, that's like...
a long time.
I wonder why that might be. I don't know. It's an infinity on one side. We have a nice little set there. It's point in time to infinity. Very exciting.
So what does it mean? Or I suppose maybe I'll just answer that question instead of asking it. I think what we see here is actually very related in verse 1. Walk before me faithfully and blamelessly.
Yeah.
And then to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. I think those ideas are very intertwined. The idea that in order for him to be their God, they have to walk before him faithfully and blamelessly. Or else, well, he's not their God. Mm-hmm. Getting to that idea of relationship, right?
Yeah.
God is saying there will be this relationship between us. And what does it require? It requires faithfulness. Mm-hmm. Very much like a marriage, I think. And I think we could actually use that throughout here, but I don't know if we want to do that or not. But just for this one image, right? It's like, if you're not faithful in your marriage, is it really a marriage?
I mean, I see what you're getting at. I think this is a little bit hard to speak. Like, it's a weird way to phrase it because it's like, okay, this is the reason why I think we can just get into marriage. But, like, I think this is the reason why adultery is given as a reason for divorce. In the Bible, it's like, do not ever get divorced unless they commit adultery. Mm-hmm. And I think the big reason why is because you're breaking your covenant. Like, you're breaking a covenant. Like, you're literally breaking one of the most sacred things. Mm-hmm. And I think I was thinking about this idea of marriage because I think it is helpful here when we're thinking about the idea of a covenant of descendants. Which is like, so if two people get married and they have kids, when they are getting married, they are making a covenant that is also an obligation to their children that are non-existent yet. So it's like, the covenant that they're making is that they will care for and provide for all of those children. And they will raise them, right? And so even though those children don't exist yet, even though they have no idea what those kids will be like, when they are getting married, they are making that covenant beforehand. And I think that's kind of the same idea with God. Of like, when he's making that covenant, obviously he actually knows what all those children will be like. So it's a little bit different just in that respect. But he is making a covenant between Like, by taking on Abraham, he's taking on all of mankind afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you break a covenant, you're revoking a relationship, basically. You're saying, like, I'm not going to fulfill what I said I would fulfill anymore. And
then there's another aspect, actually, of this covenant. And that is, in verse 8, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So repeating there at the end, that relationship, but then also tying in the land with it, the land of Canaan, which is present-day Israel.
Yeah. I think maybe another analogy is like when you're saying that when you're getting married and you're making that covenant and applies to your children, your future children, you're also making huge material sacrifice. Obviously, like, you are saying that, like, you are going to provide for those children for as long as is necessary. And that's not only I love them, but it's also I will give them things. I will give them so many things for a very long time with absolutely nothing in return in order to provide for them. And God is also like, my little ones, I will give you land. This is for you. It is a reminder.
So this is a very critical moment in the Bible. It's like very early on, right? We kind of glossed over it, but Genesis is the first book in the Bible. And maybe it's a good thing that we waited until now, because for me, what Genesis is really doing is it begins from nothing, right?
Yeah, and literally. In the beginning, there was nothing.
Yes, pretty much. And from that nothing, God creates something. And then what we see is he creates man. Within this something. Man is sinful and falls away from God. And then the entire rest of the Bible really turns around that one point, that God has fallen away, man has fallen away from God, that humanity is no longer coupled in this relationship with God as they should be, as they were created to be. And what we see here now in...
Like, remember the coconut.
Yes, the coconut. And what we see now in chapter 17 is God is trying to restore that relationship.
Right, yeah.
He's saying, here's a way that we can have a relationship. And it requires the formation of a people.
Yeah.
Of a people who are in that relationship. And that begins with Abraham. Explicitly as this covenant. And by the end of Genesis, what we see is Abraham has gone from one person with a family beneath him. And then there's a family beneath that family. And there's a family after that family. And I think that's where Genesis ends, right?
Yeah.
And so the family has grown. But then the next book is Exodus. And Exodus begins with this family that we left off has now grown into a people.
Yeah.
It is no longer just think about your own family plus all your siblings plus cousins, right? Like
out to like your second cousins.
Yeah. It's no longer that size, right? That's still pretty big, but it's...
It's definitely, you wouldn't call it an entire people's group. Yeah.
Right, it's not a people. But by the time we get to Exodus, there is a people. There are the people of Israel. And what we see then in Exodus, really the next few books of the Bible, is these people fulfill the promise that God gives them.
Yeah.
And they go and they acquire this land, the land of Canaan, that God promised Abraham he would give to his descendants. And then they run into this problem of leadership. And so they're in the land and they decide that they need a new form of leadership.
Wait, actually, can we back up for a second?
Sure.
Can we stop in the middle of Exodus?
Yeah.
Before we get to, because we're about to get to kind of this new covenant, or not new covenant, but second covenant.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get there, just a little interjection, as I think it's kind of important to see throughout Exodus, one of the big kind of patterns that's being told is this repetitive walking away from God. So we just read in Genesis 17, like Abraham saying that he will be faithful, and that the faithfulness will continue through generations. That's the requirement for the covenant. And the covenant is created. And then you have these people growing, and you start back up at Exodus, and you have so many people, and you're like, oh, we know we're coming in with this idea that the covenant holds. And what we see is after we have kind of the raising out of Egypt, there's a huge moment where, so God's people had been enslaved, God brings them out. And throughout that process, what we're seeing is this constant like, yes, God, JK, like we're going back to our ways. And it's over and over and over again of going towards God and then going away from God and going towards God and going away from God. And I think one of a really good place to kind of see that is when they're actually getting the 10 Commandments, they're getting the law from God. And you have Moses, who's the one who's interacting with God. And at one point in this process, Moses basically tells people like God's going to come down. He's going to come down, and everyone sees. And Moses
is the one leading the Israelites out of
Egypt. That's a key point.
He's like the first leader of the people.
And basically the people are terrified of God. They see him and they're like, oh, they don't really actually see him, but they see his like might, and they're like, oh my goodness, that man is scary. I use man very not literally there, because he's not a human. But they see God, or they see God's might, and are like, and so they're like, no, Moses, you go up to the mountain. And so Moses goes up, and then Moses is gone like a month, and they're like, wow, Moses has really been gone a long time. Like, why don't we just make our own God? So what do? This is me being very not literal in my translation. What do they do?
My pastor actually last week, my home pastor, he was doing the similar kind of thing, like adding character to the Bible story.
This is how I read the Bible.
And he had like a great quote that I totally forgot, but it was like, if you're not reading the Bible with like imagery, it's like you're not really reading the Bible.
I feel very validated. So long story short, they're like, let's make our own golden calf out of all the gold that we have. And they make this golden calf. And they're like, yes, this is the God who brought us out of Egypt. Which everyone, you're reading that story and you're like, y'all are doofuses. That's clearly not the God who brought you out of Egypt. You were terrified of that God. And I think the interesting part is they call that golden calf Yahweh. They call him Lord. Which is really, it's like, y'all, are you kidding me? Like, they say, tomorrow, it's in Exodus 32, verse 5, where they say, tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord. And the Lord there is referring to the calf. It is also the word, like, for Yahweh, which is the name of God, like, the name of God. I cannot emphasize that enough. Anyway, so this idea, like, that's a huge just breaking. Like, that is walking away from God. And so the reason I bring that up is because, obviously, God's really mad at, like, he's like, y'all, no. And Moses intercedes.
Sends a nice plague, right? It's like the serpents. He sends snakes after them.
He said
poisonous snakes.
No, wait.
And they have to, or is that a different?
No, I think that's later, because in this case, Moses is still up on the mountain.
What is the punishment for this one?
I don't think there is a punishment. I remember is that Moses. No. Wait, maybe you're right, because Moses is up there, and God sees, obviously, because God's all knowing. God's like, y'all, Moses, your people are like idiots, and Moses has no idea what they've done yet, but he's like, y'all, like, well, actually, no, he's like, God, remember your covenant, remember your promise, like, don't kill him. You said you wouldn't kill him. Please don't kill him. Like, I'm so sorry for what they've done. Meanwhile, Moses has no idea, and then God's like, okay, I won't. Like, I'm not gonna like.
Smite them.
I'm not going to smite them. And then Moses goes down and sees what they've done and is like, y'all.
He throws down the 10 Commandments.
And I'm pretty sure then he's the one.
He gets in trouble for that.
For
destroying the law. Yeah.
Oh, I don't remember that. What I do remember is I'm pretty sure he goes and kills. That's a lot to deal with. But anyway, like, I'm pretty sure he goes and slaughters a whole bunch of people. if I remember correctly. It's a huge fiasco.
Well, he definitely destroys the calf. I do remember that. Anyway, that's like a huge tangent. But
that is a huge tangent. But basically, it's a big sin.
So
anyway.
From the beginning, right?
Oh, yes, the Lord struck up the people with a plague because of what they did in the calf that Aaron had made.
Yes.
But that's at the very end. That's after, like...
I'm vindicated.
You are vindicated. Anyway, sorry, tangent. But all of that to say that we've seen by the time that there's kind of what Tim is getting at, by the time we have... I'll let him talk about it. But by the time that there's kind of the second covenant, they've already walked away. Like, they were already walking away from God. And,
right.
So
they've already even lost the little bit of relationship they've had now with God.
So when you're thinking about when we come into the second part of kind of this Old Testament covenant, what we're coming in with is this idea that God brought God brought people back to him, his people back to him. Well, actually, no, God created peoples and through Abraham. And then we have them basically walking away from God repetitively because they're idiots. That would... We see ourselves in this, so I'm not saying them, I'm saying I as well, although not in that particular moment because I was not alive then. But still, there's coming into this, we have this idea of them having walked away from God, and so it's already God being gracious towards Israel. And
I'm glad you brought up the law, actually, because that's actually a good segue into the next covenant, because Moses, right, gets the law from God. And then what he actually becomes is a judge.
Mm-hmm.
So he actually uses the law and he judges the people based on that law. And he becomes the first in a line of people referred to as the judges.
Yeah.
Right? There's a whole book in the Bible devoted to these people. And what they do is exactly this, is they judge the people based on the law.
So people bring problems, they bring... think anything that a current judge would do, like in modern democracy. Covering that, and then some.
Mm-hmm. And what the people of Israel decide, right, is they see these other peoples around them who are kings, they have kingdoms, and they're like, that would be nice.
I want what they have.
Right. And
the grass is greener on the other side.
And God says pretty much,
y'all are doofuses.
You don't want that, but I'm going to give it to you anyway, because that's apparently what you want.
Yeah.
And so he establishes a line of kings. Mm-hmm. So he picks the first king, King Saul, and Saul is like the greatest of his family. He's like a big, strong man, great warrior.
Mm-hmm.
But Saul is not really the man that God wants to lead Israel. He doesn't want Saul's family to be the family. And so he picks, in the end, David, who is the lowest of his family. He's
like the seventh brother, I think?
Yeah, something
like that.
Really far down the line.
He is one of there's a whole lot of brothers, and he is the youngest.
Yes. And he's just a shepherd's boy when he's anointed.
Mm-hmm.
He literally comes in from the field.
Yeah.
He has to be sought out because he was just out tending the sheep. And he has to be brought in to be anointed.
Mm-hmm.
And long story short, he does some killing of giant, and
that'd be the whole David and Goliath story that a lot of people have heard of.
There's a big complicated issue with then Saul not liking David.
Tries to kill him.
Big whole fight there.
David lives in a cave for a while.
End of the day, long story short, David becomes king. And I'm pretty sure this is towards the end of his life. Maybe it's not, actually. Maybe it's actually towards the beginning of his rule.
Yes, because he still has quite a lot of other mistakes to get through.
A lot of other mistakes. And what God does is he establishes... Yes. God establishes a covenant now with David.
Yeah.
And so this occurs twice because...
the Bible's not chronological.
Right. And there are books in the Bible that overlap a lot because they're like different they're different writings of the same events. And so we see in 2 Samuel chapter 7, And in 1 Kings chapter 9, this same covenant. Which one?
I really like the way it's written in 1 Kings. I'm
Okay.
preferential towards it.
We'll go there then.
Where, actually, wait, no, the one, I take this back. This is a covenant between Solomon and in 1 Kings.
Oh.
Solomon and...
Okay. 2 Samuel it is then.
2 Samuel, I think, is the one between David and...
Yes.
Basically, there's lots of renewals of covenants, is what you're hearing here.
Yes.
David being key one, because Solomon, also great guy, but is the son of David, so...
And he's actually referenced in the covenant with David. Maybe we'll get to that, I don't know. Or we'll just gloss over it. I'm trying to find where I actually want here. So this is 2 Samuel chapter 7 that we see. The whole chapter is really the covenant with David. But in verse 10, no, not verse
I think
10.
maybe 9 is a good place to start, or 8. Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and anointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. The Lord, and then further down, the Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. Shall I continue?
Well, yeah, and I'll continue, I guess. So now we're in verse 13. He is the one who will build a house for my name. This is actually referring to Solomon. Mm-hmm. Solomon builds the temple.
Which is actually where I was reading from, or about to read from in 1 Kings, is right after he builds the temple, and that's when there's another renewal of the covenant.
So he is the one, Solomon, is the one who will build a house for my name. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod wielded by men, with floggings inflicted by human hands. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever.
And then at the very end of this chapter, David replies in prayer. And near the end, verse 27, he says, Lord Almighty God of Israel, you have revealed this to your servant, saying, I will build a house for you. So your servant has found courage to pray this prayer to you. Sovereign Lord, you are God. Your covenant is trustworthy, and you have promised these good things to your servant.
So first, the covenant. I think it's very important to see that, once again, we have this indefiniteness, right? Mm-hmm. Your throne will be established forever.
Yeah.
I will never, my love will never be taken away from him. Two ideas there of never-ending time. And then I think that ties into what you added on there at the end with what David says, is he has confidence that God will not go back on that promise to say forever. There are parts where God says, if you don't uphold this part of the promise, then I will inflict punishment, right? That is part of the promise. It's not saying, if you don't live up to your side of the bargain, that's okay. I'll just keep going and do my end of the deal. He's saying there are punishments if you don't do what I'm asking you to do.
Yeah, I don't know if punishments is the best way of phrasing it, but it's like there are consequences maybe.
Yes.
Because it's not like, I think there's a distinction between God going out and being like, well, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm going to like slaughter all your people. Mm-hmm. Versus being like, no, the only reason you're not being destroyed right now is because I'm protecting you.
Yeah.
And those have very different consequences in terms of the way that you're... And technically they are the same thing. Like by the nature of God being sovereign and being all-powerful, like I think you're like... He inherently is... This is more complicated than maybe it is, but like he's inherently declaring what is a punishment, like what will happen, which means like you can phrase it as punishment. But all that to say, I think it might be a little bit more helpful to think about it as consequences.
Yes.
Like
consequences.
Yeah.
So what is this promise saying? Right? Your throne will be established forever. Does this mean that the kingdom is just never ending?
I mean, David's kingdom for sure not, right? Like his rule obviously ends, so it can't be that literal. Like it's not that literal. But I do think there is this element of the line of kings that come through David is everlasting.
The royal line. I know we live in, most people in the world today live in democracies where we don't have this royal lineage that rules everything. But I think that's what we're getting at here, that your line of kings, not only will they always exist, where you always have descendants, but I think even more importantly is that they will rule, or there will be this idea of rule within your family to come in the ages to come.
And that really speaks to something we'll be talking about more tomorrow. It's a little...
Well, tomorrow for us.
Tomorrow for us, next week for y'all.
Next week's episode. Great things to look forward to, let me tell you. But what we see, not only does Solomon not live up to his end of the bargain,
darn,
he gets some hefty punishments set against him.
Oh.
But what we see after Solomon is David's line. Well, there's a whole complicated story.
Wait,
about
Solomon?
Solomon?
What are you saying?
Well, Solomon.
Wait, did you? Okay, never mind. I think I may have confused myself. I think I may have thought you said the wrong person, but I don't even remember anymore. So, continue. My bad.
I said whatever I said. I meant Solomon.
Okay. Wait, I think. Oh, I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm confused. Continue.
So Solomon doesn't live up to his side of the bargain, gets some punishments. But what we see after Solomon, even kind of bypassing this long, complicated story where Israel actually splits apart, and you have the 11 tribes, right? Because there were 12 tribes of Israel, versus the one tribe of Judah, which is then the continuation of David's line.
Yeah.
But what we see is in both kingdoms, right? Now there's this divided kingdom of Israel. And in both kingdoms, both of their kings fall away from this promise. They fall away from this relationship with God, and they lead their nations astray into the worship of other gods, of cults, cultural cults that were all around, pagan worship and everything. And what happens?
Not good things. Well, actually great things, ultimately.
But what happens chronologically?
Where did you end off? My bad.
You should have listened. I left off. The kings are bad. Both kingdoms of Israel are pagan worship, cult worship. Don't care about God whatsoever. What does the promise say?
Well, God remains with Judah.
Yes.
Oh, is that what you're getting at?
No, that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is Jeremiah 3. If we want to turn there. The punishment, right? Or the consequence, to use the proper terminology now.
Oh, I know what you're getting at now.
Yes.
Sorry, I got a little lost there. I can't read people's minds. I've been trying for a long time.
I thought you've done pretty well up until now.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored. I try to keep up, but Jeremiah 3.
Chapter 6.
What?
Chapter 3, verse 6.
Okay.
My bad.
Well, yes.
During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, Jeremiah, by the way, is a prophet. This is a book containing prophecies that God has given him to give to various kings of Judah. Mm-hmm. During the reign of King Josiah, the Lord said to me, "Have you seen what faithless Israel has done? She has gone up on every high hill and under every spreading tree and has committed adultery there. I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not. and her unfaithful sister Judah saw it. I gave faithless Israel her certificate of divorce and sent her away because of all her adulteries. Yet I saw that her unfaithful sister Judah had no fear. She also went out and committed adultery. Because Israel's immorality mattered so little to her, she defiled the land and committed adultery with stone and wood. In spite of all this, her unfaithful sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but only in pretense, declares the Lord. That is a very brief summary of what happens to the kingdoms.
Yeah.
Included in this imagery that we've used before now of marriage, of
idolatry. I mean, like we've seen from the very beginning, as we talked about in Exodus 23, in the very, very, very beginning, we had the golden calf. Like one of the first things that Israel did was worship another god, and call it Yahweh. And here you have this kind of contrast once again with like committed adultery with stone and wood, where stone and wood are represented like materials used to make idols. There's this idolatry against God that comes back once again as a theme.
Mm-hmm. So, what happens now that they break this relationship? Israel breaks the relationship first. Mm-hmm. Judah follows suit, as Jeremiah 3 said. And what happens is they both get conquered. Mm-hmm. Israel gets taken over by the Ammonites.
You're asking the wrong person.
Okay, well, this is like very.
You don't
broad
understand.
Overview.
They get conquered so many times.
That is true.
To the point, it's like who's.
Yeah, Israel just gets swept away. Judah lasts a little longer, right? Because
that's correct.
They were a little more faithful, but still unfaithful at the end of the day. And what happens to them, and what most of Jeremiah is about, is this prophecy of the sweeping away of Judah, the conquering of Judah by, do you know that one?
No.
The Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar. And so Jeremiah consistently says to the kings of Judah, he says, listen, Babylon's going to come, they're going to conquer you, and they're going to take Israel away, but God's going to leave a remnant. And he's not going to completely abandon Israel.
Right.
Because he's faithful and merciful and just.
Yeah, I think the merciful and just are probably big ones here. Can I read the next little?
Yeah.
Next little bit. So verse 13 goes, Return, faithless Israel, declares the Lord. I will frown on you no longer, for I am faithful, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your guilt. You have rebelled against the Lord your God. You have scattered your favors to foreign gods, under every spreading tree, and have not obeyed me, declares the Lord. Return, faithless people, declares the Lord, for I am your husband. I will choose you, one from a town and two from a clan, and bring you to Zion. And there's this idea of like, despite the fact that Israel is faithless and Judah is faithless, God is still pursuing them anyway. And so in this case, there is this idea of only acknowledge your guilt, and that is that's a hefty requirement, right? It's like, but God in His mercy, because God, I think maybe the key point here is like in the same way, if you're thinking about marriage, like if someone commits adultery, that is such a great. Maybe that's not the good way of phrasing it, but you're breaking a covenant to the point that there is no covenant. Like the covenant's been broken. It's not there anymore. And so you're under no obligation to be faithful to that person, which is to say that like if you, you're not obligated in the same way you were before. And so I think it's important here when talking about God is that I think it's easy to come in because God is so great and so big in comparison to us. It's easy to read passages like this and be like, oh, well, God's clearly pretty spiteful, or God's clearly pretty mean. Or be like, well, God should have just taken them. Of course that's what God should do. He's God. God should just take him back anyway. And it's like, no. if you're making a covenant, that's important.
And I'm glad you brought us back to the covenant, because this takes us all the way back to that covenant we saw in Genesis 17, where God says, I will be your God and you will be my people, and you will have this land of Canaan.
Yes. And
what happens? God is no longer their God. They are no longer his people. Therefore, they no longer get the land. But I think that's important, right? That idea that you're talking about, that, well, why can't God just like be completely merciful, and it doesn't matter what they do, because God is a God of second chances, right? That's something we hear in the Bible, and therefore they just, they deserve to stay. But the important thing is, right, that any time a promise is broken, there's a cost.
Yeah.
And somebody has to pay that cost, right? That's what justice is. This idea that there are punishments, that there are consequences when things do not go as they ought to. And so, if you don't have that, the only way you can have mercy is if there is justice, I think. This is like very high-minded talk. What am I saying? It's like...
Well, I feel like this whole, we haven't even gotten to what it means for us to be faithful, so,
Well, maybe we'll just like come back at the very end and like summarize what we mean by everything. This is a very deep concept, I think.
It's very meaningful to us, right?
Yeah.
It's like that's why it hurts so much when a friend like isn't faithful to you, right? Or like a friend does something that like isn't. Yeah. Like that's why the whole concept of backstabbing hurts so much. There's like, a cost. Yeah, you're putting your trust in someone, and for someone to break that trust and break those promises that they made to you is like, it hurts. It hurts a lot. And
what justice is the idea of that cost. Yeah. Justice is the fact that there is a cost when promises are broken, when things do not go as they ought to. And then mercy, I would say, is the paying of that cost by the person who's been wronged. Yeah. That's what mercy would be. And we'll get into that next week, but very, very beautiful time coming up. And we'll get there in a little bit. But, Judah and Israel are, both kingdoms of Israel, the divided kingdom, is now just conquered. And Jeremiah is still alive, and he writes now a book called Lamentations. And this is an incredible book in the Bible. Yeah.
It's basically full of laments, which are basically just... I think the best way of describing it are like cries to God when you're at like the lowest point. A lot of them are... There's 3 of them, right? 4? 3. I think there's... Right? There are not that many Lamentations, right? Am I missing? Wait. How long is Lamentations? I'm forgetting. I think it's pretty short. I could have sworn there was
it's not too long. Yeah.
It's like...
There's 5 chapters.
Oh, okay. So I'm 2 off. That's why 3 sounded short. I was like, what? That's New Testament letters are that short. But anyway, all that to say, Lamentations are basically cries to God.
And specifically in this context, they're cries to God because God has literally just swept away his people. Yeah. Or the people that were supposed to be his people. And this is Jeremiah like grappling with that fact and as you said, crying out to God because, well, he is a God of justice. And in this instance, there was a cost for unfaithfulness. Yeah. And so one of the things he says in chapter 3, verses 22 through 24, he says, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. Right? I said there's this remnant left over. They aren't completely swept under the rug. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will wait for him.
And would you know it? Great is your faithfulness is a lyric from the song I was talking about earlier, coming full circle, talking about promises, talking about how great is your faithfulness to me. Yeah, but because I think it's God is faithful, right? He obviously, if you look at the Bible and you flip to where Lamentations is, there's more left. It's not the end, right?
Yes.
And I think that itself speaks to God's faithfulness. There's more to the story. Mm-hmm. Even though at this point we have seen God's people walk away from him so many times, in big ways and in small ways, if you want to think about it that way. Still, there's more to the story. And it's like, why is there more to that story? Well, there's more to the story because God is faithful.
Yes.
And even when we're not, in his love, I love how it says in Lamentations, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. And I think that's a great way of putting it, because no, it is in fact God's love. God's love for us is the reason why we're not completely consumed, because we deserve to be. It's like Israel at that time walking away from God, breaking the promise that they had made to him over and over and over and over again, was deserving of him being like, okay, if you don't, we're not going to have a covenant then. We're not.
Right. What God should have said, right, if he was only a God of justice, was, we're done.
Yeah.
That's what he should have done from the very beginning.
Right. The very moment when they first broke the covenant.
You have broken our relationship. You're done. Right? Just cease to exist. But instead, we have the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with David. And even despite then not living up to those relationships, God is still faithful.
Yeah.
And how is he faithful? Well, we have some examples. Some little hints that are going to be like a cliffhanger.
A little sneak peek into next week's conversation.
This is actually, for me, what is most remarkable about the Bible is how we're going to look at Jeremiah again, Jeremiah chapter 30 now. But we're also going to look at Isaiah. Isaiah was a prophet. Was he for Israel? Or was he also for Judah? I don't know. I confess my knowledge.
I could have sworn. I think. You ask good questions. I don't know the ordering.
I ask questions that I don't know the answers to.
I honestly don't know what time period he came at.
Anyway, well, we'll try and find it.
One or the other.
So
I think Israel.
That's what I would think.
Because I'm pretty sure.
I can just look in my Bible. It should tell me.
I'm pretty sure Israel.
No, it sounds like he's to
Judah?
To Judah as well.
No. JK. Well, because the reason why it's confusing is a lot of times when you're talking about, prophecy, you're referencing the history of a nation. And obviously the history of Judah is very intertwined with Israel. It's because at what point they were one. It's hard not to get confuzzled. All of that to say, do we want to start in Jeremiah or Israel? Or not Israel, Isaiah. Whatever.
Yes, definitely to Judah. He lived most of his life in Jerusalem, which was the capital of was it the capital of the Judean kingdom?
So this is why we should go to seminary.
Northern? I don't know.
We do not go to a Christian college.
We have not been formally educated.
There's no Old Testament 101 class.
Maybe there is, actually.
I don't think there is. I think
maybe not in the college.
No, not at the college. There might be at JTS.
Or at Union.
Oh, yeah.
Which is actually not... It's technically an affiliate school. Which is interesting.
What's an affiliate mean? I don't know. Isn't JTS an affiliate?
Yeah. I think it's mostly to do with the fact that they're religious.
Yeah, it's like saying they're separate.
Right.
They're entirely separate universities, but there's course over
but they're overlap. Affiliated. I don't know what that means.
Anyway, back to
tangent again.
Back to Jeremiah, the end of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 30. Do you want me to read 10? So it's Jeremiah 30, 10 through 11. and says, "Do not be afraid, Jacob my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel, declares the Lord. I will surely save you out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Though I completely destroy all the nations among which I scatter you, I will not completely destroy you. I will discipline you, but only in due measure. I will not let you go entirely unpunished."
So this, I think, is a promise. Again, promises all over the place.
Woohoo.
And this one is fulfilled pretty quickly, right? There's two ways to read this, I guess. One is in a sense of the restoration of the people of Israel, which happens... we'll talk about that next week, I guess. Maybe. Should we talk about that this week?
How about next week?
Okay.
It ties in better.
Okay, we'll talk about that next week then. Yeah, because I guess they still aren't their own nation. They're still under the boots of other people. Yeah. Anyway, that's what this is getting to. This is like the restoration of the people of Israel.
Yeah, brought back together.
But Isaiah, that's a little deeper. Isaiah chapter 30.
1 through 2 says, actually, I read the last one. I'll wait for you to flip. He's got,
quick fill in the gap while I find it.
He's got one of those old-fangled Bibbles.
Old-fashioned.
Yeah, old-fangled. Because it's like not a newfangled, it's like old-fangled. Anyway.
I mean, it's not that old.
It's really... Have you seen the memes about like when someone with like a physical Bible, like it's like a meme of a guy in like all dressed up, but like fake dressed up, and it's like when you walk into Bible study with like a physical Bible instead of one on your phone. It's meant to be like this anyway, making fun of him being like royalty or something.
That's funny.
Anyway,
fashioned. So Isaiah, is this the right thing? This is not chapter 40. I knew 30 was wrong. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. That meaning at the very end, it's always confused me that she's received double for all her sins. I'm like, does that mean she's received twice as much punishment as she should get? No, it's saying that you get double the reward for all of the sins. Yeah. Not reward in like consequences, but double like the good things.
Yes, so
you get twice as much good things for as much bad things as you did.
Yeah, you've been blessed doubly despite your sin.
Yes.
What?
This will be, and actually, I think next week we're going to read a couple verses after that. Continuing this second promise that we have, and we'll see how it is that her sin has been paid for, and that the Lord has given her double for all her sins. So, brief recap. Not recap. Overview. What do we see about faithfulness in what we've looked at? What can we say about God's faithfulness?
Yeah, so I think we can say that his faithfulness is kind of like the unwaveringness of his promises to us, to his people, despite their faithlessness. And so he's faithful regardless of kind of their actions, out of his own, like out of mercy and love. And so I think kind of the question we normally focus on that we haven't really focused on as much this time is like, what does it mean for us to be faithful? And I think that really gets at kind of our faithfulness is to be a reflection of his faithfulness.
Yeah.
So for us, we strive to be consistent and unchanging, just as God is consistent and unchanging in his promises towards his people who are unfaithful. And so that means for us being faithful towards others, going to those witness meetings that we are 34 minutes late to. So know that we say this out of our own sinfulness.
Yes.
We are sinners. Woohoo! That was not an excited. That was a sarcastic excitement. Yeah. In case anyone thought that maybe it was otherwise. But that our faithfulness is a reflection, kind of a mirroring to a certain extent of what his is. We aspire to be faithful like he's faithful, which is forever and unchanging.
Forever and unchanging. And what we've seen, particularly for me, is that idea, as you said, mercy and love, of always coming back. Of like when God's people, we were unfaithful to God, that covenant is wiped away. Not wiped away, but it's like broken. And God restarts. He's like, all right, here's a new covenant. Like, let's do this again. It's like, however many times we will be unfaithful, God will be re-faithful. Like, not in the sense that he was unfaithful and then has to be faithful again.
Right, no, but it's saying that the covenant, we break the covenant.
We break the covenant.
God's like, no, I'll
and God comes back to us.
Yeah.
And we'll see that again next week. To the highest degree possible.
Yeah.
I'm very excited for that. So what's like a question we can ask ourselves heading into this next week?
How are we not faithful?
How many witness meetings do we miss?
How many witness meetings are we missing? And then maybe a follow-up is like, in what areas do we need to work on being faithful, like God's faithful? Like what
I don't know, like what general promises, obligations in your life do you tend to be faithless to the most or more often? Because I'm pretty sure there's an area for most people.
Oh, for sure. We're human after all. Yeah, so I think maybe a nice little summary is, when we're thinking about that question, is thinking about how our faithfulness is going to strive to be like God's faithfulness.
Rock solid.
That's the title. Rock solid. That's where the title came from. And like God's faithfulness isn't dependent upon our faithfulness. And so when we're obviously keeping in mind our own human limitations when we're answering that question, but looking at
the striving towards. Yeah,
the striving towards is a key thing. And maybe because this is a bit of a tangent. I know we're wrapping up, but like when it comes to why I'm like, for example, why both of us are not making it the witness meeting right now, would be because we are finite beings. Like we are incapable of being at multiple places at one time. And so there are certain things we just can't promise that God can promise, right? Yes. We're not God. And so part of the very nature of being faithful is recognizing what our human limits are and being like, no, I have 2 exams this week and like 2 problem sets. I can't be making flyers, so I have to say no, or I can't make a promise to hang out with someone this week. And so being aware of kind of what our own limitations are is important.
Don't overpromise yourself.
Yeah, and then also look, I don't know, at least for me, then looking at God in comparison is like, oh my goodness, wow, he doesn't need to do that. He's not he doesn't have those human limitations.
Right.
Pretty darn cool.
Right, and so just to like recap one more time, what we're imitating or trying to imitate, what we're striving to be like, is God's faithfulness that we've seen to the Israelites, to his chosen people, of even when those promises we make are broken. First of all, the aspect that we aren't the one breaking them. We want to be the one who's not breaking the promises and obligations we have in our lives. But second of all, when other people break them, what do? We come back. We don't say, I'm done with you.
Yeah.
For all time, we say, I'm coming back to you, because we care about that relationship.
And I think another key part, I kind of forgot about that until now, but like when we are unfaithful to God, part of us striving to be faithful like God means coming right on back to him as well. So it's this idea of like, as Christians, we're coming back to him, or we're striving to come back to him when we will undoubtedly be unfaithful. Yeah, so I think that's all we have this week. I think this is going to be one of the longer ones, if I timed it, if I remember correctly. But that's because there's so much. The story is so cool in the Bible.
I mean, we've said before, the greatest story ever told. So exactly. I think to limit it to even an hour is like,
Yeah, hopefully in the future we can start breaking it up a little bit more and really deep diving into certain topics or words or anything like that. So thank you for tuning into this week. If you have any specific topics that you'd like us to talk about in the future, please hit us up on a whole bunch of social media platforms or emails, etc.
Right. Thank you for listening. Let me say that myself. As Grace-Elleda said, we want to know what you're interested in hearing. So we'd love to hear your feedback.
Yeah. And
you can keep up to date with the content we're putting out and give us your feedback on either Instagram or Facebook if you follow the Columbia Witness. And that way you'll see what we're putting out. You'll also have opportunities to directly engage with us. But also, one thing that maybe you can do besides just following us yourself is to get other people to follow us. Like, who can you think of in your life that would benefit from this weekly encountering of God through a podcast?
Yeah. And / if you listen to something and you're like, oh my goodness, I need to rant about this to someone else, we also accept that form of sharing. Send it over to someone else and be like, if minute 3 were you just like, what in the world? And then also send us an email at witnessthegoodfight@gmail.com. And we look forward to
continuing our story.
Yes, continuing our story
next week.
Adios all.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on The Good Fight, where campus meets Christ.